Hi, everybody, and welcome to Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
Lindsay Thomas. I'm associate professor in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell University.
And Prof. Thomas, thank you so much for doing this. It's greatly appreciated. Lovely to have you here. And it's called, did I get that right? Literatures in English.
Correct.
That's a great title. Does it require a bit of explanation to 17-year-olds or no?
It might. It might. Like many other departments in the United States and elsewhere, it used to be called the Department of English until relatively recently. The name change predates my arrival, but several years ago, there was a sort of push within the department to change the name to better reflect the type of work and teaching that scholars are doing in the department, which encompasses literature not only from traditions and nations that are primarily English speaking, but also literature in translation and Anglophone literature from many other parts of the world. So the new name better reflects our cross-disciplinary, cross-national, trans-temporal work that we do here.
And no doubt you saw today on this topic that Wole Soyinka had his visa revoked.
Yes.
Our administration.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The more focus on the importance of those, in inverted commas, other literatures that
yes.
can be, the better, I think, especially at a time of crisis like this. So not that you need it, but you have my full support. So, Prof. T, I wonder if you would tell us what's currently impeding, preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing you.
Sure. Great. And thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. I think I maybe have two answers to this question. The first has to do with my own scholarship, my own research, which I've been thinking a lot about, to put it as broadly as possible, the value of quantity and the histories of reading in literary cultures of the United States in the 20th and 21st century. So I'm working on a project about the length of novels and whether and how they got longer over this time period and what that looks like or what it might look like. And I'm also thinking a lot about what people tend to call AI and large language models and utilizing these models for literary research, but also thinking about the limits of these models, the limits of how they're situated culturally, what we can do to poke and prod them and to better understand them as cultural technologies. And so that's sort of projects that I'm involved in right now to do with that have to do with the project about AI slop. And thinking about the role of summarization, particularly in relation to literature. So that's the research is kind of quantity and the value of the literary today and in the 20th century. And also because I'm located within the United States and I'm currently director of graduate studies in my department, which means I'm being confronted daily with what's happening here financially and particularly to universities and the effects that has on my students. And on many students across the country. And so I'm thinking a lot about the crisis, the many intersecting crises, I guess we could say, of higher education in the United States right now, precipitated by the current administration, and the deluge of horrible things that are happening daily. So yeah, those.
When I was director of graduate studies, my principal concern was the fact that there were students who'd done their preliminary exams, their comps, as they're sometimes called, one in the year that The Sound of Music was released and the other in the year that Abbey Road came out. And so had a quarter of a century of matriculation to make up, or not, and had to be certified as ready to teach based on the very a la mode when it came to knowledge. You're confronting something altogether more serious. But let's get back to this new word, which discloses that you've been reading the Harvard Business Review, namely
yes.
slop.
Yes.
Now, a word I only encountered, apart from its original use, this week in the context of slop work. No, last week, sorry. Share it with the group. WTF. What is
yes
work and how does it relate to artificial intelligence?
Right. So, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in public discourse generally over the past few years that these large language models like ChatGPT have gone mainstream and are accessible to larger publics, about the outputs of these large language models, or the image generating models, the Gen AI models, whether it's text or images. And a lot of discussion is about how these outputs are not good, and not good in many different ways, meaning from just the quality itself to indicative of current political regimes and realities, and how a lot of discussion recently has been about how the far right utilizes Gen AI to create propaganda. And so that term AI slop, in the projects that I'm a part of, we're trying to get our heads around slop as a term that encompasses everything from, a student who has written an essay with ChatGPT, and someone who has produced a report on demand of their boss, using ChatGPT, to, the diarrhea plane that happened a couple weeks ago, put out by the Trump administration. So we're trying to think about not only what AI slop is. It's a product of artificial intelligence, generative AI systems, but also the scale at which it operates, and how people use and deploy it in various contexts.
I noticed that Deloitte had to repay $250,000 to the Australian government for having produced a report
Mm,
with idiotic artificiality
yes,
that had what people like to call, bizarrely, hallucinations
yes,
throughout.
yes.
It's
Yes,
just
or just
fantastic.
exactly, yeah, or just the inaccurate things that the models generate, because they don't have a concept, of course, of what is accurate and what's not accurate, or what knowledge is and what isn't knowledge.
So
So,
those things sound really, really fantastic projects. And particularly the one about the size of novels is part of what makes your work so appealing to me, in that whilst you're interested in textuality, meaning, genre, you're also interested in the material institutionality of literature, something that we're used to in the study of television or cinema, but not
mhm.
so much, I'd say, in the study of literature. You're nodding, which makes me think I may have got that right.
Yes, I think it's changing. There has been a push in the past 5 to 10 years with the scholars in a lot of different corners of literary studies, but particularly what's often called post 45 or 20th and 21st century US literary studies, to think about the publishing industry, and to think about specifically the conglomeration of the publishing industry in the latter half of the 20th century. So that work is new and is coming out more and more. But of course, as you indicate, there's a long tradition of this in media studies, and film and television studies. And that is where I first became interested in these questions. I got my PhD at UC Santa Barbara in the English department there, which is a very weird English department, I've come to learn, in the sense that my training was very much located at the intersection of media studies and literary studies. And so I learned a lot about what was happening in media studies, at the time, industry studies, that type of perspective at the time. And I have carried that forward with me. My first book was about a different type of institution, the institutions of the national security state. But I am always fascinated and interested by how literature or fiction, or what it means and how we value it within particular institutional contexts.
Before we return, if we can, to this question of material institutions, let's say, I've read quite a lot of your work, but I wasn't able to get hold of Training for Catastrophe, National Security, and the Use of Fiction after September the 11th. So would you mind filling me in and other fellow ignorance?
Sure, no worries. So that is a book that is looking specifically at how U.S. national security institutions, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, but not exclusively, utilized fiction and fiction making after September 11th, 2001, toward particular ends. And one of my main arguments there is that, those ends have to do with training people within the United States, to think of some things as disasters, particular things as disasters, and to ignore other kinds of disasters. So to recognize, a hurricane as a national security threat, which is a kind of weird way to think about hurricanes, but also then to ignore the very real disaster of something like white supremacy that creates things like active shooters in the United States. And so my book is about how the national security state utilizes fiction, and that by that I mean sort of hiring fiction writers to create and write for them training scenarios that then officials and bureaucrats will enact as part of their jobs, to train them to respond to disaster, emergent national, what are called emergent national security disasters in specific ways.
And didn't they also go to Hollywood to ask about
Yes.
potential scenario that would be
Yes, yeah. I opened the book with a story about the Science Fiction Writers Research Association, which is describes itself as a think tank for science fiction writers, and has especially in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, I think less these days, was contracting with various national security agencies at the federal level to write training scenarios for them. And so this was a think tank about 40 science fiction writers.
So for people who don't know, think tank in the United States means people not good enough to get research one jobs in US universities, but with a certain facility at writing bullshit reports that can be from the center, the right, or the center left. Mindless idiocy that gets huge bourgeois media attention.
Yes.
And
Yes.
indexes governmental tendencies.
Yes.
Be they
Yes.
from the Democratic or Republican side. So think tank
Yes.
means know nothing, but
Yes.
full
But
of
a lot of
opinion.
yeah, exactly. A lot of opinions and potentially a lot of influence and power at these federal
Yeah,
at the
real
level of the
influence,
federal government. Yeah.
real influence and power, real damage to real people
Yes.
done by these things. And of course, as someone who's lived in Southern California, two people who both lived in Southern California, we know how the Rand Corporation,
Hmm.
I think originally a creature of the Navy, is
Yes.
central to this, along with Brookings on
And
the
DARPA.
side,
Yeah.
American
Yeah.
Enterprise Institute, American Heritage, and so on the right hand.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
and these things are governing our lives, actually, and not just in the United States. So that's great. That's really, really interesting. And it makes me think that I'm wasting my time. Why am I not cashing in on being an idiot?
Well, I had that thought once or twice as I was writing that book.
Um, Returning to this issue of materiality, have you yet found a satisfactory answer to whether and why books might be getting bigger?
Oh, I mean, I'm working on it, and I think the question that I'm still at right now is whether we have been working on that with data from the HathiTrust Digital Library, which is a collection of millions of digitized volumes.
Okay.
They've partnered with Google Books, and that effort that happened in the early 2000s. It's really the best data source that we have of for for fiction from the 18th through the 21st century. And it's the data that they have is taken from mainly in large part North American libraries. So it really reflects what particularly university libraries in North America, the United States and Canada have on their shelves. But it's kind of the most comprehensive source that we have for literature and for fiction. And so we're using that metadata, or the data about those books, to just try and determine in the 20th century, are there periods in which novels seem to get longer? There seem to be two periods right now, and we're working on making sure this is correct. There's a lot of books. We're working with a data set of about 70,000 titles. That it seems like from about 1926 to 1941, there was a big increase in the average and median numbers of pages of novels that were published, mainly within the United States. And then it also seems like in the 80s and 90s, there's another increase in the length of novels. Our data set only goes to 2009, so I can't answer questions about right now. But it does look like in the 20th century, at least, it's about the 1930s and the 80s and 90s where novels do seem to get longer. And I think there are different potential reasons for that, but I'm still thinking about that.
Are you prepared to share your provisional analysis, or is it?
Sure. I mean, I think in the 1930s, it's interesting because a lot of the longest novels from that time period are published by women. And they are novels that today we would classify as middle-brow or just bad. And so they've largely been forgotten. They're of the style of Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind has been remembered, but there's a lot of other books of that kind, especially after Gone with the Wind was published and became so popular. A lot of sort of what we might call social realist, middle-brow, domestic fiction by women, mainly white women of the time, that is not really discussed much today. And these novels can get long. And a lot of those novels at the time, although not well remembered today, were bestsellers, or they sold pretty well. In the 80s and 90s, it's a different story. In the 80s and 90s, you have on the side of literary fiction, a lot of the longest novels are being published by authors who had previously won prestigious literary prizes at some point in their careers. And they were not winning those prizes for these novels. There's very few of them, of the novels themselves, the long ones at least, that are prize winners. But the authors at some point in their lives had won these awards, and sort of perhaps maybe that's indicative of a license to write these longer texts. The novels themselves, I said, don't win prizes. They don't sell well, but they are prestigious and literary. And so you see a lot of, that's when you start to see what scholars have identified as the encyclopedic literature of the 70s, 80s, and 90s appear, Don DeLillo, et cetera. At the same time,
sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, at the same time, there's also a genre story there, because in the 70s and 80s, you start to see the publication of fantasy and sci-fi novels in series. So the publication of very long fantasy and science fiction novels published in 2 or 3 or 4 volumes as a series. It's really one long, huge novel, but it's broken up into these parts for sale.
And around the time your research ends, you get the explosion of the trilogy, where people
Yes.
in the young author or young audience,
Yes.
young reader
Yes.
category are signed on
Yes.
when they've only written one book, with the understanding that they must do 2 more, right?
Yes.
So that's going
Yes.
to be the next thing for you guys to deal with, I imagine.
Yeah.
Young
Yeah.
adult
The sort
fiction,
of
YA, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The YA explosion is huge, and publishers have figured out that they can sell more novels, or they think at least they can sell more novels if they're selling novels by authors who have previously sold novels. And so there's a lot of pressure on authors and on publishers to put out stuff by people who are already known. So that means series and trilogies, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these doorstoppers, some of the early podcasts that I did in this series, episodes from 2010, 11, 12, were when a couple of agents decided that I might be a good way of getting to the YA audience. And so I'd sit down in Griffith Park or elsewhere with YA authors who were mostly kind of guy numbskulls who somehow or other had got an idea, probably from their girlfriends, and the idea had become, this is what the novel will look like, and had gotten big contracts to produce trilogies. As far as I can tell, none of the people I interviewed ever published anything. I think they just took the money and ran, right?
It
Anyway,
happens.
I'm sure. Well, I've done it. No, in my case, not a lot of money. But very interesting, Prof. And of course, I suppose that with the exception of Pulitzer's, a lot of those prizes in the Anglo world would be post-Second World War.
Yes.
Sort
Yeah.
of
The
sign of
vast
the
majority
sea.
of them. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I almost want to say all of them. The prize, or what sort of James English has identified as the prize economy, only really picks up steam after World War II in the United States, with the establishment of the National Book Award and others.
Right. And I've tried to work this out, but I haven't found out an answer. What stimulated them? Is this publishers getting smart?
I think it's yes. I think there's a lot of energy. I mean, from my reading in there's a lot of energy from publishers around this question. And so it's good advertising, right?
Yeah.
I also think that there's something to be said about the role of literature in public life in the mid 20th century, in which literature was, certainly as compared to today, taking up a lot more space in public discourse and was seen
Yeah.
as a more important site for that discourse in the mid 20th century. That had to do with American hegemony after World War II. It had to do with a lot of access to higher education, the GI Bill in the United States, more people than ever going to college, and more people than ever taking college English classes where they're reading literature.
And
So I do think that that reflects the status in public life of literature at the time.
and in the 40s and 50s, you get those trailers for Hollywood films where the beginning is a book that's been a bestseller and you see the pages turned, and they're by
Hmm.
authors you've never heard of, even though
Yes.
the film can be quite well
Yes.
known. This is your earlier point about names that are forgotten. Yeah?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of authors at that time, 30s, 40s, 50s, were able to make a good living by writing screenplays, by adapting their novels, even if they were not huge literary celebrities, or were only had one novel that sold okay. They could there was a lot of they could make some money by doing a screenplay.
Chandler, Faulkner, Fitzgerald
Yes, yes,
on the booze,
yes.
unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately.
There they
Yeah.
were, like great, really, truly great writers doing
Hmm.
it. And why not? Prof, flying forward a bit, you have a great piece about book talk, not book talk, but book talk. Can you share with us, WTF, Prof, book talk? What is
Sure.
this
Yes.
strange creature? I mean, everybody your age and below knows this, but everybody a bit older than you has no clue, I think.
Right. So it's BookTok is a what I've come to call a sort of online bookish space. It's a space
Mhm.
on a particular social media platform called TikTok, the one with the videos. It's become quite popular since about 2020 in the United States. And Book Talk is a kind of corner of TikTok, or a niche, as they're sometimes called, or a side of TikTok. These are all the words that people use to describe the different areas of interest on TikTok. But it's a niche where people are talking about books and about reading, and it's gathered together not only through the hashtag Book Talk, BOOKTOK, Book Talk, but that's one of the main ones through which people sort of tag their videos as being relevant to that community or that discussion. And you see and what I talk about in that piece is you see a hugely wide range of types of videos about books and particularly about reading on Book Talk. And so it's become quite a popular space where lots of people are contributing. But a lot of the conversation is around reading and around being a reader. So people will film themselves reading. They will include shots of their bookshelves. They will include shots of them opening up bags of books that they purchased from their local Barnes and Noble. They will do some. They will do recommendations. You know, if you're interested in enemies to lovers romance fiction, here are my top 5 recommendations. They will sometimes do reviews of books. You know, why I hated this book, why I loved this book. There's a lot of different stuff happening on Book Talk, but it's what I call in that piece a sort of parasocial literary recommendation system, where you get the sort of feeling as if you have a friend recommending you a book. Um,
In 2007, I was about to publish a book which came out the next year, good year for books, called Make Over the Nation, the United States of Reinvention. And I was talking to a
mhm.
friend of mine who was a publicist in Hollywood. And she said, "Oh, I know about these young guys who are cheap, who might help you promote it." So I spoke to them and they had, the 20,000 buck offer and the 3,000 buck offer. And the 3,000 buck offer was where they would get students who were interns at Cal State Long Beach to write all over the internet that there's this amazing book by Toby Miller. It's incredible. It's got this chapter on ADHD. And I decided I couldn't do it. It would just be wrong. So my query to you, Prof, is how much of this is bot labor or paid labor promoting things?
Really good question. Yes, it's really hard to tell. As Book Talk became popular and kind of exploded during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States in particular, 2020, 2021, 2022-ish, um, more and more people were posting on BookTok, but also publishers were trying to figure out ways of getting into the game themselves. And so publishers were trying to figure out, how can we make BookTok work for us? How can we make this system that is a powerful algorithmic recommendation system that's driven by a sort of friendly face, insofar as people are watching videos of actual people giving these recommendations? How can we make that? How can we make this advertising work for us? And they've tried a couple of things. Penguin, for instance, is currently putting the most money into BookTok sponsoring of creators. It's still not a lot of money though. If you look at how much money Penguin is spending on digital marketing compared to print marketing or more traditional marketing like book tours, et cetera, the more traditional marketing dwarfs the digital marketing. And so I would say publishers haven't yet quite figured out how to fully monetize BookTok, but there are certainly creators who are being paid by publishing houses, probably not paid very much, because only the other thing about TikTok, like any social media system, it's only a very few at the top that are getting paid any type of livable wage, right? Most people are getting paid, if they're getting paid, it's not very much. It's pennies out of the creator fund, for example, something like that. It's not something that you can live on. But people are getting paid by publishers and also doing sponsorships. So to advertise books or reading lights or, book paraphernalia, those types of things. And Barnes and Noble also got into this a little bit. And I talk about this a bit in the piece
You do,
of
yeah.
sponsoring creators to go and shop in their stores and to film that shopping. And as part of Barnes and Noble's image of being anti-Amazon.
I remember when it became a hookup place.
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to remember when Barnes and Noble was the evil, big box bookstore, and there's been a sort of
Yeah,
shift.
yeah. So, Prof, as they say on Blue Jays or Dodgers television, going back, you've got an article that I loved about something that was a big deal on television when I was a child because there were commercials of it. Speed reading.
Oh,
And the commercials in favor of buying a subscription, I guess, to speed reading, it was never quite clear to me what these involved, proliferated on television. It was impossible to avoid them. And you've got a certain sympathy for this, even though for many people it was just a scam. So tell us, A, what on earth made you interested in this phenomenon that obviously interests me because of my vintage? B, what it was, and C, whether or not it was a scam.
yes. What made me interested? I think watching Annie Hall. There's a line in Annie Hall when Woody Allen's, I think maybe it's Diane Keaton's character is talking, or no, it's Woody Allen's character talking about reading War and Peace. And Diane Keaton says, "What is it about?" And he said, "Well, he's saying I took a speed reading class and I read War and Peace." And Diane Keaton says, "What is it about?" He says, "It's about Russia." And I don't know. That was my introduction to the being a little bit younger, my introduction to the concept of speed reading. And then later on, I just happened to run across when I was in graduate school, so maybe 12 years ago now, on YouTube, an advertisement for the Evelyn Woods dynamic reading, where it's one that I mentioned in the article. Her name is Louise Mayhew. She's she's speed reading a novel on camera on this talk show, on this game show. And I thought that was so bizarre and weird and fascinating to me, because why would you care about speed reading a novel? I can understand wanting to speed read work reports, memos, law article reviews, if you're a lawyer, if you're a businessman, whatever, all these people were advertised to help them with information overwhelm. But the fact that Reading Dynamics, Evelyn Wood's speed reading company in particular, was obsessed with literature and reading fiction was very strange to me,
Yes.
and I never forgot it. And after I finished my first book, I just thought, well, I would like to learn more about this. And so I went to Evelyn. I found out she has her papers at the Utah Historical Society. I went there and looked at them. And that's sort of what drew me into this question. And it opened up larger questions about the history of reading in the period for me. Um, Whether or not it was a scam, sure, probably, yeah. Mostly it was a scam. But I think what's interesting to me, as I argue in that piece, is that regardless of whether it was a scam, regardless of whether you can actually teach someone to read 5,000 words per minute, which I don't physically really think is possible. Nevertheless, the fact that speed reading in the mid 20th century became such a phenomenon is interesting to me. And the fact that the most popular speed reading company, Evelyn Woods Reading Dynamics, was built and organized around the reading of literature and of fiction, was also very interesting to me. So that I think there's a larger story there about the history of our discipline and the history of how people value the reading of literature at the time.
I love the photographs you have piece of hand movements.
Yes, I was, oh my gosh, I love that.
It's
The
so
the
fantastic.
diagrams.
It's like
Yes,
Marcel Mauss techniques of the self, but at the
Yes.
maximal level. It's like you're a swimming coach or something. So
Yes, it's
tell us
very
about
much a,
this business. Wonderful.
yeah, there, I draw a sort of comparison to Evelyn Wood as a sports coach, and she did this series of advertisements for this Salt Lake City gym, like fitness gym, health spa it was called, where they were using her image to promote their gym, and using her image as a sort of what they called a dynamic woman, an active woman who's traveling around the world and teach people to read actively. So Evelyn Wood's method evolved to move away from the use of machines. So speed reading as a popularization of it really comes out of the science of reading in the early 20th century. There was a lot of research done on how quickly can people actually read in budding disciplines such as cognitive science, psychology, etc. Speed reading in the mid 20th century is a popularization of that research of that research program, and people realize that they can make some money by advertising this skill to lay people everywhere. That you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of stuff you have to read in your job at school. Take our classes, and you will become a better, more efficient, faster reader. Evelyn Wood's method grew out of a sort of reaction against devices and machines in the classroom. People sort of it had been popular in the research programs to use things like tachistoscopes, which are measuring how quickly one can perceive an image. And so there was a lot of sort of apparatus in the way of the reading. And Evelyn Wood's innovation, I guess, was to move away from reading devices and speed machines, and to teach people to use their hands to move down the page in various patterns to train their eyes to, the idea was, she claimed, take in a whole page at a glance. And she claims that she had a whole story about how she learned to do this while she was sitting by the side of a stream in Utah, et cetera, et cetera. But her whole project, I argue, part of what I argue in this piece is a return to, or a defense of, or a shoring up of the human reader in an
Yes.
age in which reading machines are beginning to proliferate. So in an age in which computation and computers are beginning to read in a more real sense, this is a type of shoring up, or a reaction to that, or shoring up of the human reader and human reading, embodied reading processes.
But it's still Taylorism. It's still scientific management,
Oh,
isn't it?
yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah. There's elements of that for sure. Yeah.
you're no enemy, Prof, of machines. And although I'm sure you're a skeptical user, there's a great co-authored piece you've done about the status of the humanities. And for those outside the United States of America, sorry, America is the right way to say it, isn't it? America. And this is the white, lower middle class, working class
Right. Yes.
pronunciation. I've heard each year between Christmas and New Year, the Modern Language Association holds its annual conference, or I think that's roughly when. And the New York
Yes.
Times has this game where it sends some incredibly witty person to go and listen to panels, or at least read the program and go, ha, 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 Jane Austen and lesbianism, ho, ho, ho. And it's part of their assault on intellectual activity, but it's
Yes.
not science in inverted commas. And it's part of the assault on the humanities that now has taken off and become much more politicized. You and your colleague look at the bourgeois media's discussion of the humanities in public, and you're not so pessimistic at the end, I think. Is that fair
Yeah, it
to
was.
say?
Yes, yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. That article is coming out of a project I worked on for a long time called the What Everyone Says Project, where the aim of that project, it was cross-institutional. It was involving over 100 different faculty and graduate students over the course of its 4-year run, where the point was to try and examine what we were calling public discourse about the humanities. So how people talk about the humanities and how people perceive the humanities outside of the universities. What's the status of the public discourse? And when we started this project in about 2012, when I was still in graduate school, this was right in the midst of the Great Recession, right in the midst of huge cuts that were happening at the University of California system where I was located in graduate school. We started this expecting to see a lot of pessimism and critiques of the humanities, and you do see that. But where we ended up is that was a bit of a surprise, is seeing how the humanities or ideas connected to the humanities, but also the idea of the humanities itself, the study of histories, languages, and cultures, how that becomes important in everyday lives, how it shows up in very boring or everyday genres such as obituaries. I mean, not boring to the people who write them, but everyday genres such as obituaries, such as event announcements, announcements about a speaker series that's happening at a local library or a museum, or at universities, or how the humanities become closely associated, and we see this as a positive thing with teaching and with pedagogy, and with students and with the classroom. And so, although we began the project expecting to, or hoping maybe to try and map out the negative critiques of the humanities that we were feeling and still seeing to this day in the media, we also started to notice how the humanities through these various forms of media affect people's everyday lives, and that was a bit of a surprise, but also a delight.
And Prof, you were also in the intellectual vanguard in that about a decade before anybody else, you were writing about pandemics.
Mm.
When you were in grad school, you're talking about these things there are articles that I've read from 2012 and 2014,
Mhm.
I think.
Yeah.
The rest of us barely know what this word means. So again, give us the scoop, please.
Well, it was part
What were
of
you
my,
up to? What were you up to?
yeah, yeah, my dissertation is related to my first book, and that my dissertation was about national security. It was less focused on fiction and more on different media technologies of national security. But I became interested in thinking about pandemics specifically within national security context, and how pandemics in the 21st century after 9/11 in the United States are framed as national security threats, which again, I think is still to this day weird to me and fascinating to me, that these pandemics aren't only natural, neither is a hurricane, but these sort of natural disasters get framed and get consumed by the framing of being national security threats, which is a choice that the United States national security agencies make after 9/11 to encompass all these types of natural disasters and to frame them as national security threats.
And there are ways of making money if you're a university. I mean, think of all the research grant funding made available after September the 11th in all sorts of ways,
Yes.
but they can have very good impacts. I'm thinking of the way in which the military has tried to keep climate change on the agenda,
Yes.
for example, by talking about it as a real and be a threat, by talking about things like access to water being the source of wars,
Yes.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And it's part of the challenge that I faced as I was writing the dissertation, and part of the challenge of the book, which ended up focusing more on fiction and fiction writing, is that the part of the story of the United States national security state, it doesn't, of course, just start with September 11th. It comes out of a much longer and mainly liberal tradition of governance, which states that one of the primary functions of the federal government can be is mitigating risk for people and taking care of people,
Mm.
right? That's a much longer liberal tradition of national security that begins in the United States around World War One. And so that was a complicated bit of the project, because I came to learn, or I felt like from reading a lot of scholarship in the area that's often called security studies scholarship, a scholarship by qualitative social scientists on national security, that A, there's just a much longer history to national security than what happened after 9/11, and B, that history is complicated because it starts out as coming from a post-World War II liberal imagination of what the federal government can do for people. And then after September 11th, or leading up to September 11th, that radically changes and morphs into something else. And so, while at the same time, of course, the federal government, until recently, in the United States, was one of, the only places where people could turn if your house is destroyed by a hurricane, right? Or if as we all experienced in the United States in 2020, if you're in a pandemic with people getting the COVID relief checks, like that is of that liberal tradition of governance, and of imagination of national security that doesn't completely go away after 9/11, but that gets subsumed um, by different types of ideologies from the far right.
Now, Prof T, I've got one final question for you, after which I'd like to invite you to add anything you may wish. That could take the form of traversing terrain we've already covered a bit, where you've just thought, oh, that stupid bastard forgot to ask me about this, or I forgot to say something about this. Or it might be that stupid bastard completely neglected this aspect of my work and I want to advertise it, promote it, damn it. Yeah. But prior to that, my last question, which is about the last of your essays that I was able to get a copy of, which is about a trilogy, getting back to that word we used earlier, that I've not read. And this is Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, which again relates this essay from about a decade ago to national security, but also to climate.
Yes.
Could you tell us a wee bit about that paper?
Yeah, sure. So Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, written in the 90s, is about the colonization of Mars in the near to medium term future. And the vision that he has for that at that time is a colonization primarily and first of all by scientists. And so it's really also a trilogy about the changing of the Martian climate so that to make it a livable planet for people. It's the first book in that trilogy is called Red Mars, then it goes to Green Mars, and then it's Blue Mars when sort of the planet's oceans appears. It's about geoengineering. It's about this fantasy of, it's a colonial fantasy of taking over another planet and fleeing the Earth because the situation of Earth in the novel is not great. But despite that, the trilogy is primarily optimistic about science and about science's ability to fight and to direct the climate. And so it's in some ways a kind of allegory. Kim Stanley Robinson's a little bit ahead of his time writing this in the 90s about the dangers of climate change that we've now come to more fully accept, not everybody, but many of us. And it's a sort of allegory about what if we could as we do, control the climate, but in a more positive direction. And so that's the kind of fantasy of that trilogy. And I talk in that piece about that trilogy as a kind of counterpoint to the national security state's imagination of climate disaster, which is very punctuated and which doesn't take into account the long-term consequences or the long-term causes of climate change.
Do you think the drug-addicted man-child has read this trilogy?
No.
Do you think he's
I
been
doubt it.
told? Do you think he's been told about it?
It's possible. It's possible. But yeah, Kim Stanley Robinson might be beyond him. I would say.
Maybe, I mean, how many children has he got? Maybe 13, 15. He doesn't know.
Yeah.
No one knows.
Yeah.
Maybe the drug-addicted man-child's children have read this, one of them, and read it.
That's possible. Yes,
it.
that's certainly possible. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, Kim Stanley Robinson is an interesting writer for a lot of reasons. He has made a concerted effort across his career to not shy away from difficulty and complexity, but to try to project optimistic futures and think about like more optimistic, but yet still concrete ways of facing the problems of techno-capitalism.
So maybe a little more critical than the drug-addicted man-child would be.
Yes. Yeah.
But we both have the fantasy of Mars. Let's go, girl.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. The fantasy remains. Kim Stanley Robinson, he's writing in a hard sci-fi tradition. And so he's quite concerned with what it might, quote unquote, actually look like and the science that it would involve. But yes, it's still within that tradition of other world colonialism, for sure.
Jules Verne, I guess, would be dystopic.
Yes. Yeah.
From way back. Prof, to bring things to a close, are there things you'd like to add? As I said, they could be entirely new, or they might be revisiting something that we've touched on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say that one thing that I'm starting to get more excited about, but also, feeling like I'm not quite wrapping my head around it or not quite sure what to do with it is a lot of emerging work on AI, in quotes, generative AI that's happening across the computational sciences in particular. A lot of my work has been about deploying methods from natural language processing in within literary studies or cultural studies, or thinking about data within literary studies and cultural studies. And I've recently started to work with groups of researchers who are really located within the space of working on generative AI as computational scientists. And that's an interesting challenge to work across that disciplinary divide and to figure out how to talk to each other about the things that matter to each of us. I think one huge problem is the corporate capture of generative AI, and the fact that these technologies have a lot of applications for research of all kinds, but that using a lot of the largest models right now involves kind of severe ethical questions and considerations that I'm still trying to think through and to work around, vis-a-vis my own position as a researcher in the humanities. But talking to computer scientists who are using these models in their work and understanding how and why they're using it, and getting and them hearing from me about what I think is interesting and the sort of cultural uses and concepts of AI has been a really exciting activity that I've been up to in the past 6 months or so. So I'm excited to see where that goes, but it's also hard.
I used to know slightly Michael Oriard, who was an NFL player when he was doing his doctorate in English.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't explain the NFL to people in the English department, and he couldn't explain Moby Dick to people in his NFL team. So I do have one more question. Do you feel a bit on the outer within the literacies and English department and a bit on the outer with the computational science
Yes.
folks?
Yes. Yes, for sure. I mean, I think I've made a career of making myself legible to the English people, and making sure that they don't see me as scary and as a traitor and as not as someone who's not a humanist at heart, which I am, I'm very committed to humanist scholarship. But right now I'm definitely feeling like I'm not sure how to talk about these things to either of the communities that I'm working with. And so it's an interesting time, an interesting challenge intellectually for me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Listen, Professor Lindsay Thomas, thank you so much. Your work is great. I can't wait till more of these things bear further fruit. But I guess I loved learning about BookTok and the surveillance state, but most of all being propelled back to when I was 13 watching commercial TV and advertising that saw a person's hands. You saw the end of their jacket and their cuff, and then quick, like rifling through pages of a book.
Yes.
And my being hypnotized by these commercials.
Yes, me too. Me too. I mean, a little bit later, but I felt the same watching it on YouTube, for sure. Yes.
It was wonderful having this chance to chat with you. As I said, I've gained a great deal from reading your work, which is the case really with all the people I've had the good luck to, in inverted commas, interview. But it was even nicer having a chat to you and seeing, by the way, if anybody's a student at Cornell, a really welcoming and lovely office that you have.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Please, if you're at Cornell, please come say hello.
Cheers. It was lovely. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.